"Do you even know who he is?" A businessman stood up abruptly. His voice was filled with disbelief. Caroline Mitchell, a seasoned flight attendant, froze. It felt as if the ground beneath her had disappeared. Murmurs spread through the first-class cabin. Passengers glanced at each other, some pulling out their phones, their fingers moving rapidly across screens. The expressions around her ranged from shock to disapproval, and all of them were directed at her. But the most unsettling reaction came from the man in seat 2A. He remained calm, composed, his eyes carrying no anger, just quiet disappointment, the kind that spoke louder than any words ever could. And then it hit her like a freight train. The man she had just doubted, the one she had subtly humiliated, was Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google. A tidal wave of embarrassment crashed over Caroline. How had she made such a terrible mistake? Just a few hours earlier, everything had seemed perfectly ordinary. The sun cast a golden glow over Los Angeles International Airport, LAX, as passengers hurried through the terminal, their suitcases rolling noisily behind them. The departure boards flickered, announcing the upcoming Oceanic Airlines Flight 207 to Boston, a route frequently traveled by business elites, celebrities, and high-profile executives. Inside the first-class cabin, Caroline Mitchell, a flight attendant with 15 years of experience, adjusted her uniform meticulously. At 42 years old, she prided herself on maintaining impeccable service standards, especially in the exclusive first-class section. To her, this was more than just a job. It was an art form, a delicate balance of grace, efficiency, and unwavering professionalism. She moved down the aisle with practiced precision, ensuring that every glass sparkled, every seat was perfectly aligned, and every magazine lay flawlessly placed on the armrests. Just then, Rachel, a young flight attendant with only 2 years of experience, approached her nervously. "Everything is set for boarding," Rachel reported. Caroline gave her a firm nod, straightening a slightly misaligned pillow on one of the plush leather seats. "Remember, Rachel," she said, her tone firm but instructive, "first class isn't just about luxury, it's about maintaining an image. These passengers don't just pay for comfort, they pay for exclusivity. They expect everything to be flawless." Rachel nodded quickly, absorbing the wisdom from someone who had spent over a decade perfecting her craft. As the boarding process began, Caroline took her position at the entrance of the first-class cabin, her professional smile ready. She could recognize the type of passengers before they even spoke. The tailored Armani suits, the women in elegant Chanel ensembles, the occasional Hollywood actor sporting expensive sunglasses. These were her people. Each time a new passenger entered, she welcomed them warmly, subtly noting their status. CEO in a designer suit, confident and poised, first class. Renowned film actress clutching a Hermes bag, first class. High-ranking government official, briefcase in hand, definitely first class. Everything seemed to be in order, until she noticed him. A man stepped into the cabin, walking toward seat 2A. He stood out not because he tried to, but because he seemed completely out of place. Unlike the other passengers who radiated wealth and prestige, he wore a simple black t-shirt, well-fitted but unremarkable jeans and comfortable sneakers. His only possession was a plain laptop bag, slung casually over his shoulder. Caroline's trained eyes instinctively scanned him for the usual signs of affluence. A Rolex? A designer belt? A premium leather briefcase? Nothing. Her practiced smile faltered, but only for a second. She turned to Rachel, lowering her voice slightly. "Did you check his boarding pass?" Rachel, unaware of Caroline's growing concern, nodded. "Yes, ma'am. He's in 2A." Caroline frowned slightly. Seat 2A was one of the most desirable spots in first class, a seat often reserved for VIPs, influential leaders, or celebrities. She stole another glance at the man. He didn't carry himself with the same air of self-importance as the other first-class passengers. He didn't demand assistance, didn't order pre-flight champagne, and didn't even acknowledge the luxury surrounding him. Instead, he quietly placed his laptop bag under the seat in front of him and opened his computer. As more passengers entered, Caroline found herself watching him out of the corner of her eye. Across the aisle, a business executive in an Italian suit adjusted his cufflinks with an air of superiority. Behind him, a well-known film producer leaned back comfortably, signaling for a flight attendant to bring him a drink. Meanwhile, the man in 2A remained completely unbothered. He didn't fit the mold of a first-class traveler at all, and that made Caroline uneasy. As the flight filled up, a group of young tech executives boarded, their energetic conversations adding a lively hum to the atmosphere. They walked down the aisle, laughing about market trends and upcoming projects, but as they passed row 2, one of them suddenly froze. "Holy, is that?" the young man whispered, eyes wide. Before he could say another word, his colleague nudged him forward, urging him to keep walking. Caroline's suspicion deepened. She had seen that reaction before: recognition, shock, admiration, maybe even intimidation. She stole another glance at the passenger in 2A. He was still calmly typing on his laptop, his expression completely neutral. Who was he, and why did that group of tech professionals seem so startled by his presence? The unease in Caroline's stomach grew. She prided herself on being able to identify high-profile passengers within moments. She could tell a billionaire from a multi-millionaire. She could spot a self-made entrepreneur from an inherited fortune. But this man? He didn't fit any of those categories, and that to her was a problem. She leaned toward Rachel again. "Something about him feels off." Rachel, busy organizing the service cart, looked puzzled. "What do you mean? He seems polite." "Too polite," Caroline muttered, glancing at him once more. At that moment, the man reached for his glass of water, plain water, no sparkling, no ice, no request for a more expensive option. She had served thousands of first-class passengers who always had preferences, demands, and expectations. But he seemed indifferent to all of it. Caroline's gut told her something wasn't right. As the final boarding call echoed through the terminal and the aircraft doors sealed shut, Caroline took a deep breath. She had spent 15 years mastering the art of first-class service. She knew that passengers paid not just for comfort but for prestige, status, exclusivity. And she couldn't allow someone who didn't belong to disrupt that experience. Her instincts screamed that something was wrong. She made a decision, one that at the time she thought was right. She straightened her uniform, adjusted her scarf, and prepared to approach seat 2A. What she didn't know was that she was about to make the biggest mistake of her career. A mistake that would humiliate her, shake her professional confidence, and teach her a lesson she would never forget. Caroline took a deep breath as she adjusted her uniform, smoothing out any creases. Confidence radiated from her posture. After all, she had spent 15 years perfecting the art of first-class service. Yet something about the man in seat 2A still didn't sit right with her. She had seen thousands of elite passengers, yet never one like him. He wasn't admiring the luxury around him. He hadn't made a single special request. He wasn't acting the way a first-class passenger was supposed to act. And worst of all, the tech executives had recognized him, but hadn't approached him. She made up her mind. She had to verify his credentials again. Caroline approached seat 2A, her heels clicking softly against the plush carpet. With a professional but firm voice, she spoke. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass once again?" The man looked up from his laptop, his calm eyes meeting hers. He blinked, seemingly confused for a moment, but then reached into his pocket and retrieved his ticket. "Of course." His voice was even, with a slight accent. Caroline took the ticket and examined it. The name was clearly printed. Sundar Pichai, seat 2A. Everything was correct. But still, why did she feel something was wrong? She hesitated for a second, then pressed on. "We uphold certain standards in first class," she said, her tone polite but firm. "If you would be more comfortable in business class, we would be happy to accommodate you." A subtle shift in the atmosphere occurred. The hum of conversations lowered and a few nearby passengers turned their heads. The young tech executives from earlier stopped whispering and now stared directly at her, eyes wide with disbelief. The man in 2A remained composed, his face unreadable. He closed his laptop slowly, folding his hands in his lap. "I appreciate your concern," he said, "but I am perfectly comfortable here." His words were calm. Caroline felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her. She opened her mouth to insist further, but before she could, one of the tech executives in the back finally snapped. "Are you serious right now?" The man shot up from his seat, shaking his head in disbelief. "Do you even know who he is?" The entire cabin fell silent. Caroline stiffened. The businessman continued, his voice filled with exasperation. "That's Sundar Pichai, CEO of Google." The moment the words left his mouth, a wave of realization crashed over the cabin. Passengers gasped. Some murmured to each other, while others immediately pulled out their phones, typing furiously to confirm the revelation. The businessman turned back to Sundar, his face apologetic. "Mr. Pichai, I'm so sorry for how you've been treated." Rachel, the young flight attendant, dropped the napkin she was holding, her face draining of color. "Oh my God!" Caroline felt her body lock up. The blood drained from her face. She had just suggested that the CEO of Google, one of the most powerful men in the world, didn't belong in first class. Sundar Pichai didn't look angry, and he didn't reprimand her, raise his voice, or demand special treatment. Instead, he simply let out a soft sigh, his expression unreadable. The businessman who had called her out shook his head in frustration. "I cannot believe this." Passengers began muttering among themselves. Did she seriously just profile the CEO of Google? I've never seen anything more embarrassing in my life. And he was so polite the whole time. Wow. Caroline's stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't just a mistake. This was humiliating. The cabin crew had always prided themselves on their professionalism, but here she was, having made an assumption so blatant that even passengers were appalled. She felt Rachel's wide eyes on her, but she couldn't bring herself to look back. At that moment, the flight captain arrived, having been informed of the situation. "Mr. Pichai," he said, slightly out of breath, "I deeply apologize for this misunderstanding." He turned to Caroline, his expression stern. "Ms. Mitchell, to the galley, now." Caroline felt her feet move, but she barely registered walking. She knew what was coming, and she knew she deserved every bit of it. The moment they entered the galley, the captain closed the curtain behind them. His voice was sharp but controlled. "Do you realize what you just did?" Caroline swallowed hard. I made an assumption." "You did more than that," he said. "You embarrassed our airline, you embarrassed yourself, and most importantly, you disrespected a passenger who has every right to be here." She felt the sting of shame course through her veins. "I thought I was maintaining first-class standards," her voice wavered. The captain's expression softened slightly. "Caroline, first-class service isn't about clothes. It's about how we treat people." The words hit her harder than she expected. For 15 years, she had measured passengers based on their appearances, their watches, their suits, their jewelry. But Sundar Pichai had none of those things, and yet he commanded more respect than anyone she had ever met. After what felt like an eternity, Caroline mustered up the courage to return to the cabin. The tension hadn't entirely faded. Passengers were still whispering. She slowly approached seat 2A, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Mr. Pichai," she said, voice softer than before. "May I speak with you?" He looked up from his laptop, a kind expression in his eyes. "Of course." She took a breath. "I want to sincerely apologize. I made a terrible mistake. I judged you based on appearances, and I was completely wrong." Sundar smiled gently. "I appreciate that," he said. "You know, when I was younger, I didn't have expensive clothes. Even now, I prefer simplicity." Caroline blinked. "Even as a CEO?" He nodded. "Success isn't measured by what you wear, it's measured by how you think and how you treat others." His words resonated deeply. For years she had built her career on curating an image of luxury, but here was one of the most powerful men in the world reminding her that true class had nothing to do with wealth. Rachel, who had been listening nearby, spoke softly. "I always thought first class meant looking rich, but maybe it really just means having class." Sundar nodded with a knowing smile. "Exactly." And just like that, Caroline knew she would never see first class the same way again. Caroline stood frozen in front of seat 2A, the weight of her mistake pressing down on her like a heavy fog. She had spent 15 years mastering the art of first-class service, believing she knew everything about what made a person belong in luxury. Yet in mere moments, her assumptions had shattered. The murmurs among the passengers hadn't stopped. She could feel their eyes on her, their silent judgment burning through her skin. Rachel, standing nearby, looked equally stunned. The young flight attendant had admired Caroline's expertise, but now she seemed unsure. And Sundar Pichai? He remained composed, calm, unbothered, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around him. Caroline swallowed hard. This was her moment to fix things, or make them worse. She took a deep breath. It was time to own up to her mistake. She clasped her hands together, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "Mr. Pichai," she started, her voice lower than before, "I deeply regret my actions today. I made a mistake. A big one." Sundar simply watched her, his expression unreadable. "I let appearances cloud my judgment," she continued, "and in doing so I disrespected you. I hope you can forgive me." For a moment there was silence. The murmuring in the cabin had quieted. Everyone was listening. Then Sundar smiled gently, shaking his head. "You don't need my forgiveness," he said. "You need to forgive yourself and learn from this." Caroline blinked. That wasn't the response she had expected. "Mr. Pichai, She hesitated. "I don't understand." "You're not upset?" Sundar leaned back in his seat, clasping his hands together. "I've encountered moments like this before," he admitted. "People make assumptions based on what they see, but success, intelligence, and leadership don't come from a suit or a designer watch. They come from within." The words hit Caroline harder than she anticipated. For years she had associated luxury with superiority, wealth with worth, and presentation with power, but Sundar Pichai, one of the most influential men in the world, had just proven her entire philosophy wrong. A few seats away, one of the tech executives who had recognized Sundar earlier finally spoke. "Mr. Pichai leads Google in the same jeans and t-shirt he's wearing now," the man said, shaking his head in admiration. "And yet, he runs one of the most powerful companies in the world." A ripple of understanding passed through the cabin. Some passengers who had once looked disapprovingly at Sundar's casual attire now seemed to reevaluate their own assumptions. In Caroline, she felt like she was seeing the world through a new lens. Just as she was absorbing this moment, the flight captain approached again. "Miss Mitchell," his voice was firm, "I need you to step into the galley." Her stomach tightened. This was it. She had humiliated herself, embarrassed the airline, and mistreated one of the most important figures in the world. There was no way she wasn't about to lose her job. She followed the captain, feeling the burning stares of passengers behind her. The moment they reached the galley, the captain turned to her, arms crossed. "I want to hear your side," he said. "Why did you question that man's right to be in first class?" Caroline lowered her head. I thought I was upholding first-class standards," she admitted, voice thick with guilt. "I believed that passengers in this cabin should look a certain way." The captain's brows furrowed. "You mean you judged him based on his appearance?" She nodded slowly. The captain exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "Carolyn," he said, his voice softer but firm, "first class isn't about appearance, it's about service, dignity, and respect. His words mirrored exactly what Sundar Pichai had said. She swallowed hard. "I know that now." The captain studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Then fix it." Back in the cabin, Caroline saw Sundar Pichai had already returned to his laptop, working as if nothing had happened. She hesitated. How did he remain so calm, so unfazed? Slowly she approached again. "Mr. Pichai," she began, "may I ask you something?" He looked up, nodding. How do you stay so composed?" she asked. "You could have demanded an apology in front of everyone. You could have called for my termination, but instead you just—" He trailed off at a loss for words. Sundar smiled. "Because leadership isn't about power, it's about patience, understanding, and teaching." His response left her stunned. Rachel, who had been listening nearby, finally spoke. "I've always thought first class meant looking rich," she murmured, "but maybe it really means having class." Sundar nodded. "Exactly." At that moment, Caroline knew she would never see first class the same way again. When the plane landed in Boston, Caroline expected the incident to fade away. She was wrong. Passengers had been tweeting and posting on social media about what had happened mid-flight. By the time they reached the terminal, the story was already viral. Just watched a flight attendant try to downgrade Sundar Pichai because of his jeans and t-shirt. The way he handled it, pure class. "Today I learned that true power doesn't come from what you wear, it comes from who you are." Respect Sundar. Sundar Pichai just turned an embarrassing moment into a leadership masterclass. The world needs more people like him. The airline's corporate office quickly caught wind of the situation. Instead of punishing Caroline, they saw an opportunity. They invited her to help develop a new training program, one that focused on eliminating bias and treating every passenger with dignity, no matter their appearance. At first, Caroline was shocked. "Why would they want me to lead it? I was the one who made the mistake." But the captain reminded her, the best teachers are those who have learned their lesson firsthand. A lasting impact, the final lesson. Months later, Caroline stood in front of a group of new flight attendants, telling her story. "I spent years believing that first class meant wealth," she admitted. "Then I met a man in jeans and a t-shirt who showed me that real class is about respect." The airline saw a dramatic increase in customer satisfaction. Passengers noticed the shift. Service improved, not just in first class, but throughout the entire airline. Meanwhile, Sundar Pichai continued to lead Google in the same jeans and t-shirt, proving that power, success, and respect had nothing to do with appearances. And Caroline? She never judged a passenger by their clothes again. As she walked through first class, she saw people not as their outfits, but as individuals. And every time she spotted someone in simple attire sitting in seat 2A, she smiled, remembering the day she learned what true class really meant. For weeks after the incident on Oceanic Airlines Flight 27, Caroline couldn't shake the weight of what had happened. Every detail replayed in her mind. Her assumptions, her words, the quiet disappointment in Sundar Pichai's eyes, and the way the entire cabin had turned against her in that moment of realization. She had spent years believing she understood first-class service. She thought she knew who belonged and who didn't, until the day she judged one of the most powerful men in the world solely based on his appearance. But instead of reacting with anger, he had taught her a lesson through his actions. Now it was time to prove that she had truly learned from it. The incident had spread far beyond the flight. Passengers had shared the story on social media, and it went viral within days. Major news outlets picked it up, discussing everything from the dangers of judging others by appearances to Sundar Pichai's legendary humility. Some headlines read, "Google CEO's first-class lesson, why appearances don't define worth. Flight attendant learns the hard way that success wears jeans. Sundar Pichai's masterclass in leadership, from 350,000 feet." Caroline had braced herself for repercussions from her airline's corporate office. But instead of firing her, they saw an opportunity. The CEO of Oceanic Airlines called her into his office where she expected a reprimand. Instead, he said, "Caroline, you've just been given the rarest gift, a mistake that became a lesson the whole world is talking about. Now, we need you to help us change." She was stunned. "Change?" she echoed. He nodded. "We need to do better, and I want you to help lead the change." That's how Caroline found herself working on a revolutionary new training program, one designed to eliminate unconscious bias in customer service, hospitality, and beyond. Her mistake had turned into a new movement in the airline industry, pushing staff to see beyond status symbols and focus on treating every passenger with equal dignity and respect. Months later, as Caroline was beginning to feel comfortable in her new role, she received an email that left her speechless. It was from Google. The subject line read, "Invitation to Speak, Google Leadership Summit." She stared at it in disbelief. When she finally opened it, her heart pounded. They were inviting her to speak about her experience alongside Sundar Pichai himself. She reread it multiple times. Was this real? Why would one of the most respected CEOs in the world want to share a stage with the flight attendant who had doubted him? But as she thought about it, she realized this was exactly what leadership was about. Sundar Pichai wasn't inviting her to shame her, he was inviting her to teach others the lessons she had learned. She took a deep breath and hit accept. A month later, Caroline found herself standing in one of Silicon Valley's most prestigious conference halls. In front of her sat thousands of Google employees, executives, and industry leaders, many of them dressed casually in jeans and t-shirts, just like Sundar Pichai. She adjusted her microphone, took a deep breath, and began. "A few months ago, I made a mistake that exposed my own biases," she started, her voice steady. "I thought I was an expert in first-class service, but I learned that true class isn't about appearances, it's about how we treat people." She walked the audience through the events of that day, her assumptions, her embarrassment, and the way Sundar had responded not with anger, but with patience and wisdom. "Mr. Pichai didn't just teach me a lesson," she continued, "he changed the way I see people. And because of him, my airline changed. Our entire industry is learning from this experience." The audience listened intently, some nodding in agreement, others visibly moved. Then she turned to Sundar Pichai, who was seated beside her on stage. "Mr. Pichai, you had every right to call me out publicly, to demand consequences, but instead you chose to teach me. Why?" He smiled slightly, adjusting his glasses. "Because leadership isn't about proving people wrong," he said simply. "It's about helping them see what's right." The audience erupted into applause. Caroline felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She had spent years perfecting first-class service, yet it had taken one man in jeans and a t-shirt to show her what true class really meant. After the conference, Caroline's story spread even further. Other airlines began adopting new training programs, ensuring that staff wouldn't judge passengers based on appearances. Corporate companies started using the incident as a case study in leadership programs, emphasizing the importance of humility and emotional intelligence. Even people outside of business and aviation were talking about it. A fashion influencer tweeted, "If the CEO of Google can wear jeans and a t-shirt to first class, maybe we should stop measuring people by their outfits. True class." A teacher posted, "Teaching my students today about Sundar Pichai's response to being underestimated. This is how you lead with grace." Even at Oceanic Airlines, Caroline's role expanded. She was now responsible for training thousands of flight attendants, sharing her experience, and helping reshape the culture of luxury service. But most importantly, she had changed as a person. She no longer measured people by what they wore or how expensive their accessories were. She measured them by how they treated others. One evening, after returning home from work, Caroline received a package. It had Google's logo on it. Confused, she opened it and found a book. It was titled Humble Leadership, a book about the power of leading with kindness, patience, and understanding. Inside there was a note, handwritten on the first page. Caroline, true class isn't about luxury, it's about how you treat people. Keep sharing this lesson. Best. Sundar. She stared at it, feeling a lump form in her throat. She had gone from making the biggest mistake of her career to learning one of the most valuable lessons of her life. And now, it was her turn to teach others. Months had passed since that fateful Oceanic Airlines Flight 207. Yet, Caroline Mitchell still felt the weight of that day etched into her memory. But this weight was different now. It wasn't the heavy shame she had first carried. It wasn't the mortifying embarrassment of misjudging Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google. No, now it was a responsibility, one she embraced. Because what started as one flight attendant's mistake had become a global conversation. The moment Caroline's story hit the internet, it sparked discussions worldwide. It wasn't just about a flight attendant misjudging a CEO anymore. Across multiple industries, companies started re-evaluating their training programs. Even beyond business and service industries, people reflected on their own biases. Social media was flooded with stories. A young entrepreneur who had been denied entry to a high-end networking event because he didn't look successful. A woman who was treated differently in stores depending on whether she wore casual clothes or designer brands. A man who never got second glances until people found out he was a self-made millionaire. This was bigger than just one flight. This was a lesson society needed. Caroline never expected her career to take such a turn. Instead of being quietly disciplined for her mistake, she had been given an opportunity to turn it into something meaningful. She had traveled across the country, speaking to airline executives, hospitality professionals, and corporate leaders about what she had learned. And now she stood in a conference hall in New York, preparing to address a new generation of flight attendants. She looked out at the sea of young faces, all eager, all ready to take on the world. "I used to think I understood first-class service," she began, her voice steady, "but I was wrong." The room fell silent. For years, I believed luxury was about exclusivity. I thought my job was to uphold a certain image. I thought I knew who belonged in first class. She paused, letting her words sink in. But then I met a man in jeans and a t-shirt, sitting in seat 2A, who taught me what true class really means. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some of them already knew the story, others were hearing it for the first time. Sundar Pichai didn't need an expensive suit to prove his worth, she continued, because real success isn't measured by what you wear, it's measured by what you do. She glanced at the faces before her, young professionals just beginning their journeys. And real first-class service? It's not about judging people, it's about treating them with dignity, no matter who they are, no matter how they look. The room erupted into applause. For the first time in her life, Caroline felt like she was truly making a difference. That evening, after her speech, Caroline checked her email. A new message sat in her inbox. From Sundar Pichai. Subject, keep sharing the lesson. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened it. Caroline, I heard about your work in training programs, and I just wanted to say, I'm glad you're using this experience to help others see beyond appearances. That's leadership. A small lesson learned by one person can ripple outward and change many. Keep sharing the lesson. Best. Sundar. Caroline sat back in her chair, staring at the words. It hit her then, the full weight of what had happened. One mistake, one conversation, one lesson. And now, it had become something much bigger than her.